This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour. Welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. And welcome to my first podcast in a three-part series on whisky, or as it's better known in Scotland, Uisce, the water of life. If you're new to my podcasts, I try to share with you an experience, albeit virtually, of the real Scotland, its people, its customs and traditions, and some of the amazing places to visit. Well, in this series, I'm going to walk you through the magical world of whisky. I'll cover its history, the process of its production, and talk about why Scotch whisky is revered not just in Scotland, but throughout the world. I'm also delighted to welcome onto my podcasts some esteemed individuals connected with the industry. In this podcast, for example, I will be talking to Ronni, a colleague of mine and fellow professional Blue Badge tourist guide, and a well-known Scotch whisky ambassador who has conducted whisky tastings all over the world. He is also a keeper of the Quaich, an international honour stored upon but a few, and I'll tell you more of that later. In my last podcast, I told you that I was speaking to you from Helensburgh. It's about 25 miles just northwest of Glasgow, and it was raining. Well, today the weather is sunny, with low clouds, so at least I've been able to get out for a few walks and have the odd game of golf. The easing of lockdown has started in the United Kingdom, so hopefully I'll soon be out touring Scotland once more. I already have my eyes set on the island of Islay, which I hope to visit in the coming months. And when I do, I'll bring the news of the island and its wonderful peaty whiskies. Whatever way you intend to enjoy Scotland, then, I do hope that by listening to this podcast and also viewing my monthly video podcasts, you'll get a feel for what this magical land of the Scots has to offer. In my last podcast, we travelled from Portree, the capital of the Isle of Skye, all the way around the Trotternish Ridge and called into the famous Talisker distillery, sitting in the small settlement of Carbost, and the first of many distilleries we'll visit over the coming months. It was a super 3-day trilogy of a tour of Skye, and if you've not listened to them yet, then you'll find them on my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. Actually, if you prefer listening to podcasts on platforms such as Spotify or Apple, Google or TuneIn, then simply search for the Unique Scotland podcasts and you'll find them all there. Well, for the next 3 podcasts, we've stopped touring and we're going to dip our toes into the wonderful world of whisky. There's more to it than meets the eye, so if you are an expert or an enthusiastic amateur, then stay tuned for this series which will answer your questions on everything you always wanted to know about whisky but were afraid to ask. During this whisky series, I'll be focusing on Scottish whiskies, although there will be a passing reference to the whisky made in other countries. However, I want to show you how it's made in Scotland. What are the regions of Scotland? What's the difference between Highland and Lowland whisky, for example? And what's the difference between a single malt and a blended whisky? And what can you put into a whisky? And what should you definitely not put into a whisky? And what's a Quaich that I mentioned earlier? And who are the keepers and the masters of the Quaich? We'll also be talking about a few distilleries during this series, so if you have a particular tipple, please get in touch and let me know. I could include it in one of my future episodes, and just drop me an email at john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk or get in touch via the contact form on my website. Well, I'd now like you to relax wherever you are and thoroughly enjoy this, the first of my podcasts on whisky. If you're at home and enjoying a wee dram yourself, a wee dram of the Amber Nectar, then I raise my glass to you with the traditional Gaelic Scottish toast, Slàinte. It was actually Winston Churchill who said, "Too much of anything is bad, but too much good whisky is barely enough." Well, Winston was a master at telling stories, and now I have one for you, and that is the story of whisky. In any storytelling, you should always start at the beginning. But before I go on, I want to sort out the spelling of whisky once and for all. Should there be an E between the K and the Y or not? Now, I've seen this debated by journalists and consumers, and indeed my own clients, or guests as I prefer to call them, and they have different views on the subject. So here's my take on the issue. If it's a Scottish, English, Welsh, Australian or Canadian whisky, it should be spelled without an E, and I've never seen whisky spelt with an E in Scotland. So that can be taken as fact. On the other hand, Irish whiskies do use an E, as well as quite a few of the American whiskies. And I think we just leave it there. There are differences, but in the end, who cares? We know what the word means, and we should just perhaps enjoy the golden liquid without getting hung up on spelling. However, just for my own education, if you spell it in any other way, for example, then please do get in touch and let me know. Well, for all the complexity in the taste of whisky, for all the hype about which one is best, and for all the effort that goes into the production of this multi-billion-dollar beverage, you may be as surprised as I was to learn that there are only 3 ingredients, water, grain and yeast, that go into turning water into whisky. And furthermore, for Scotch malt whisky, the process is exactly the same every time. I use the word grain because although we use barley in Scotland for our precious single malts, whisky worldwide is made from a fermented grain mash and various grains such as barley, corn, rye and wheat. But there's more of that to come. What I want to try to do with this podcast series is to take some of the mystique out of that process, perhaps break it down into its individual parts, and explain how the simple ingredients of water, grain and yeast go to provide the world with a drink that is both feared and revered. And if you think about it, it's quite incredible that a condensed liquid taken from a boiling fermented mash of grains could produce something so beautiful. But that is exactly what happens. I'll go into the actual process in the next episode, but before that, let me explain where it's believed the distillation process was created and how whisky came to be Scotland's national drink. Well, what we do know is that the process of distillation to produce alcohol was used as early as the 5th century in China and Middle East from the 10th century. We also know that alchemy is the medieval forerunner of chemistry and is well known for attempts to turn base metal into gold. However, the word alchemy or alchemia and alcohol or alcohol are from Arabic and become part of the English language in the 12th century. So the process of turning water into alcohol comes from alchemy and in some respects perfectly describes the amazing ability to turn water into liquid gold. So distillation appears to have come from China, then travelled to the Middle East and eventually arrives in Europe, but quite how it came to Scotland is still a bit of a mystery. It's believed that it arrived in Ireland in the 12th and 13th centuries, and that would tie in with the time that Christian scholars were translating Islamic texts into English and Gaelic. It's tantalising to think that some monk came across the recipe for whisky in some Arab text. He must have thought that all his birthdays had come at once. There are theories of how it arrived in Scotland, and I don't think that it is too difficult to imagine that it would have been brought over by the early Gaels who inhabited the west coast of Scotland. Also, it's known that the Beaton family, who were the hereditary physicians to the Lords of the Isles in the 12th and 13th centuries, came from Ireland, and there's a link between their medical and alchemy scholarships and their knowledge of distillation. So let me try to give you a distilled version of whisky history, and I'd like to start with the first confirmed written record of whisky in Scotland, which was in 1494, in the Exchequer Rolls of King James IV of Scotland, granting malt to a friar John Corr. He was given 8 balls of malt to make aquavitae, or as we know it, the water of life, which in turn is translated into Gaelic as Uisceva. When we say malt, it's accepted that this entry was referring to barley from which the single malt whisky is made. Actually, we're not even sure what Friar John of Lindores Abbey in Fife went on to make, but although it would have been a distilled liquid, it would probably not have been the Scotch we know and love today. Having said that, it was a spirit, and at the time we do know that the monasteries and abbeys were producing beer, so this information confirms that the distillation process had reached our shores at that time. Well, once the genie, or distillation secret, was out of the bottle, so to speak, the practice of making whisky became fairly widespread in Scotland, and pot stills sprung up all over the place. Some of it was to do with farmers who had problems with storage of excess barley that soon rotted in a wet northerly climate. So, to overcome this, some of the crop was converted to beer, and, for longer-term preservation, some was distilled, which also had the benefit of increasing the value of the crop. Certainly by the end of the 16th century, distillation and production of Uisgevar was commonplace, and most Highland families would have whisky as readily available as an Englishman would have beer. In reality, this process had become a natural part of Scottish life from the 16th to the 18th century, and the Scottish Highlands in particular enjoyed the benefits of a welcoming homegrown alcoholic beverage which could also provide a small income to supplement the family coffers. Of course, as we know in life, all good things have got to come to an end. And when any government gets wind of a lucrative little project, they always have to intervene to take their cut. And so it was in 1644 that the Scottish government introduced a tax on the spirit produced around the country. It was acceptable for a family to distill alcohol for the benefit of the individual family, but the sale of any whisky to a third party was taxed. Well, of course, wherever you've got an action, you get a reaction, and the immediate reaction to the introduction of this tax was the beginning of a whisky smuggling boom that would continue for the next 150 years. Enforcement of the tax proved to be extremely difficult, not surprisingly, as everyone declared that the produce of their home stills was for personal use. The consequence of this avoidance was the introduction of tax inspectors, or gaugers, or measurers as they were sometimes called. And there's some lovely stories of evasion of this tax, and one that springs to mind is the naming of a loch in the Trossachs, and that's an area of forest and mountains northwest of Stirling. It's said that Loch Drunkie, yes, I said Loch Drunkie, is named so because there were a large number of whisky pot stills hidden in the hills surrounding the loch. If word got out that the gaugers were on their way, the whisky was poured into the loch, thus giving the name Loch Drunkie. As it happens, I will be doing a video podcast of the Trossachs, which will include Loch Drunkie, so watch the space for its availability on my website and also YouTube channels. Well, the late 17th and early 18th century saw considerable political upheaval in the British Isles, and in 1707 the Parliaments of Scotland and England joined, and Great Britain was officially formed. Now, Scotland's national debt at that time was of huge proportions, and one of the consequences of England paying off this debt was for the Scottish people to accept equal taxation, albeit with a staggered introduction. In 1725, a malt tax on beer was introduced, which caused a brewers' strike in Edinburgh and riots in Glasgow. The army was called out and a number of people on both sides were killed. The unintended consequences of this tax was a huge increase in the smuggling of whisky from the Highlands to the Lowlands. Indeed, smuggling became an art form, as smugglers were seen as local heroes, fighting the unjust imposition of laws that shook the very foundations of a Scotsman's liberty. And it was not unknown for the clergy to be involved as well, and whisky could easily be hidden in churches, as well as some reports showing that coffins made excellent receptacles. Well, in 1782, over 1,000 illegal stills were seized from the Highlands, and it's believed that these were just a fraction of the stills in use at that time. The type of still used by the average farmer was a pot still. It was made of copper with a cylindrical body, a double-handed rim in the middle, and a bulbous section at the top, which led to a curved, tapered cylindrical spout. It was only about 3 feet tall by 3 feet wide, or 1 metre by 1 metre. I'll explain the process of distillation in the next episode of my whisky series, but the principle used, even with this small pot still, is effectively the same today, just with larger quantities. Up until the middle of the 18th century, the distillation and much of the drinking of whisky was confined almost entirely to the Highlands, until lowland malt distilleries began to cater for the growing urban population. The advantage in the lowlands was a good road system and plentiful access to grain and fuel, and indeed a number of legal distilleries were established in Edinburgh and Glasgow. In these towns, great whisky dynasties that still exist today were born, such as Haig's Lowland Distillers. The main problem for these distilleries in the 18th and 19th centuries, however, was that the illicit trade in the Highlands and all the whisky smuggled to the lowlands meant that it was almost impossible for the lowland distilleries to compete on price. And that's when the lowland distilleries started to mix the more expensive barley with other grains to try to reduce price per unit, but this sacrificed the taste, and Highland malts were sought after even more. Noting how difficult it was to police or monitor the whisky produced for private use and the excessive Highland production of the illegal whisky, it was almost inevitable that an act was passed in 1781 banning the private distillation of spirit altogether. So, whereas in the past you could have a small pot still on your property for your own consumption, the whole practice was now outlawed and the pot still had to go underground. In reality, with no major increase in the number of excise men, then little really changed. And add to that, if people were caught with illegal stills, the punishment meted out by the courts was often very lenient, because the judges were often the landowners who depended upon their tenants paying their bills. Now, if those tenants were jailed because of illegal distillation, then it was the landowners who suffered because of the non-payment of their rents. Well, it took another 40 years to break the deadlock in the system, and in 1823, the 4th Duke of Gordon, one of the largest landowners in Scotland, proposed an Act of Parliament that would see the immediate halving of tax on whisky. The effect was dramatic, and it broke the monopoly of illegal distillation by reducing the production costs of legal distilleries, allowing them to flourish, and laying the very foundations of the modern whisky industry today. Now, the smugglers' reaction was to rail against such measures by burning down legal distilleries, but this soon passed and legal distilling prevailed, with the number of licensed distillers increasing accordingly. Well, it's interesting to note that it was one of the Duke of Gordon's own workers, a farmer called George Smith, who was the first person in Scotland to take out a licence for a distillery. In fact, he founded the Glenlivet distillery in 1824 on Speyside. Now, some other distilleries that started legal production in the next few years included Bowmore of Islay, Strathisla and Balblair on Speyside, and Glenmorangie north of Inverness. I keep saying legal production because if any of you have been to Scotland and visited a distillery, you may have seen dates prior to 1824 on the buildings, and you'd be right. The oldest distillery is believed to be Glenturret, and that produces the spirit that makes up the blended whisky, the famous grouse, and that's been operating in the same location since 1775. Well, Bowmore of Islay comes second with 1779, and Strathisla 1786. Well, up to now I've been discussing the production of whisky in individual distilleries, where production quantities were controlled by the distillation of one batch of mash at a time. The great sea change to the whisky industry came about because of the invention of a distillation process that saw a huge increase in the amount of spirit that could be produced from one still. That invention was the Ennis-Coffey still, which saw a distilling process that was able to produce 30,000 gallons a year, which was considerably more than a large pure malt distillery that might only be able to produce about 10,000 gallons a year. And it consisted of a continuous and rapid production of distilled spirit. The only downside was that it was not well suited to barley malt, as it was to grain whisky, so it could not produce a satisfactory malt equivalent whisky, and even today the Ennis-Coffey Continuous Still is known for its cheaper production of grain whisky, other than barley. Having said that, it still meant a glut of whisky, and this cheaper product became popular with large numbers of Scots who could not afford the single malt equivalent. The main change in the malt whisky industry was when another Act of Parliament in 1860 allowed the mixing of malt whisky and grain whisky, and the true blended whisky was born. People like Andrew Usher was one of the first distillers to take advantage of that act, soon followed by others, and that gave birth to the great blending houses such as Dewar and Ballantyne. Of course, this massive increase in production had to be matched by an increase in consumption, and at that time the spirit of choice in the main drinking countries of Europe was brandy and fine wine. Well, by a stroke of luck, certainly for the Scots whisky producers, the overproduction of the Amber Nectar was saved from an unexpected source. It was a small bug whose name in Latin was the Phylloxera vastatrix. It was an aphid from America which destroyed the vineyards of Europe. Well, without the wine, the champagne and brandy of Europe, whisky became the drink of choice. It's also clear that the distillers upped their game and took advantage of methods of advertising and changed the image of whisky, and they broke away from the stigma of whisky's association with the smuggling Highland ruffian to one of more refined gentlemen taking part in more leisurely pastimes such as hunting, fishing and shooting. Well, it certainly worked, because even after the Phylloxera vastatrix was brought under control, whisky remained on the tables of Europe as an equal partner to the fine wines. From those early beginnings, with a few legal distilleries operating, fast forward to today, and there are over 130 distilleries operating in Scotland. In recent years, some have closed, but others have sprung up, especially what we'd call the micro distilleries or the boutique distilleries. It's quite difficult to keep up, and a conversation just yesterday had me at odds with a colleague who told me there were 133 distilleries where I can only count 132. Anyway, we agreed to differ, and also agreed that for such a small country such as Scotland, it's incredible that we have so many distilleries. And I've also been surprised in my travels by coming across a couple of distilleries that seem to just appear out of nowhere. Well, it's either that or I just hadn't noticed the actual building going up on the latest building site. But two in particular that I'd like to mention are the Clydeside Distillery and the Holyrood Distillery in Edinburgh. The Clydeside Distillery lies on the banks of the River Clyde. I occasionally work on board a small luxury Scottish cruise ship called the Hebridean Princess, and it was on a jaunt up the River Clyde that I noticed by chance this beautiful glass-fronted building with whisky stills visible from the outside. It was the newly opened Clydeside Distillery. Now, the River Clyde runs through the centre of Glasgow, so it was aptly named. I have to say, it does look super with its converted clock tower and copper stills clearly visible through the huge plate glass windows. The Holyrood Distillery has taken an old railway goods shed on the edge of Holyrood Park and turned it into a modern whisky distillery, and a return to distilling to the centre of Edinburgh for many years. Well, other new whisky distilleries commissioned in the last couple of years are Bickey in Arbroath. Its whiskies are traditionally Highland in style and will only be released at ages 14, 18 and 21 years old. So you can see the downside of whisky distillation already. I mean, normally returns for investment take a minimum of 3 years. But in this case, the first release will not be until 2029. Another one is Ardnahoe on the island of Islay. It's one of the newest distilleries there in over a decade. Then there's the Borders Distillery, the first distillery to produce a spirit for whisky in the Borders since 1837. Now, traditionally, the Borders region did not have a strong distilling presence, but now it can claim to have one of the newest. On the Isle of Skye, there's a new distillery at the opposite side of the island to Talisker, and that is Torvaig, another small but beautiful building opened only last year. Well, I hope that quick trot around some of the most recently opened distilleries in Scotland gives you an idea of how vibrant the whisky industry in Scotland remains today. And before I introduce my guest, Ronni Berry, the whisky aficionado and keeper of the Quaich, I would like to tell you what a Quaich is and how one becomes a keeper of the Quaich. Well, effectively, it's a special kind of shallow drinking cup or bowl with two handles. It gets its name from the Scottish Gaelic Quaich, meaning cup. This drinking cup can be traced to the Highlands, and it was not until the 17th century that they were to be found in the lowland cities as well. One experience that I personally had with a Quaich was when I was invited to a regimental dinner in Edinburgh Castle in the Royal Scots Officers' Mess, and during dinner being invited to take a rather large dram from a Quaich. The custom was for two officers to stand up at the dining table, and one would pour the other a sizable whisky into the double-handed Quaich. That officer would then drink the whisky from the Quaich, and once he finished, he'd turn the Quaich outwards one revolution to show the assembled company that he had finished the dram. He would then hand the quaich to his companion, sit down, and as he sat down, the officer on the other side would stand up, and this continued until the quaich had travelled all the way round the room. I'd now like to turn to the keepers of the quaich. They are an exclusive and international society that recognises those that have shown outstanding commitment to the Scotch whisky industry. And keepers of the quaich are dedicated and passionate people around the world who are proud to be part of a select society and who are dedicated to achieving greater appreciation of Scotch whisky. Well, I'm delighted to have with us Ronni Berry, one of the keepers of the quaich, to talk to us about his own dedication to Scotch whisky. Ronni, from Israel originally, changed his birthright for a kilt some 30 years ago when he married a Scots lass and settled here in Scotland. He admits to raiding his father's drinks cupboard at the age of 13, and one of the spirits that he found was whisky. His father, on discovering Ronnie's transgression, was not too hard on him, but advised him that whisky was an excellent drink that he would have to grow to appreciate in later life. Well, this is exactly what Ronni has done. And when he first moved to Scotland all those years ago, he was surprised at the lack of knowledge and understanding of Scotland's national drink, and he took it upon himself to discover the hidden secrets of Scotch whisky. He was inducted as Keeper of the Quaich in 2014, a well-deserved reward for his dedication to his craft. Ronni, welcome to my Unique Scotland podcast on whisky, and I'd like to welcome you to my show.
Delighted to be here.
No, my pleasure, I can assure you. A few questions that my listeners would like to hear from you, and the first is that when you came to Scotland all those years ago, what was it that attracted you to whisky, and how did you become so involved in the whisky industry?
I suppose the easiest way to describe it by default, I did have the interest before. My interest in Scotland was more general, and whisky being very much a big part of it, and me have a special interest in it kind of brought the whole things together. When I became in 1996 Blue Badge Scottish Tourist Guide, it's opened more doors to find a niche to myself. One of the things that I felt that there's not enough knowledge there among the people that should present to visitors and guests to Scotland, not enough knowledge about Scotch whisky, not enough particular interest into it. It was just as a very general part of the whole umbrella, Scotland. So to go perhaps more into the small details is what I felt that I can really make my niche or my speciality into it. And from there on, the interest was there, which is very easy to pick up those small details and make them my own. And I always kind of felt that people that come into Scotland should feel more unique rather than being part of a whole big experience, which perhaps a coach tour or a bigger part of visitors to Scotland will say, well, we have to visit a whisky distillery. It's very much part of Scotland. So I'll take it further and I'll concentrate on the people that Scotch whisky is their reason of coming here, and then everything else coming on top. So that was very much.
And what sort of support did you get from the whisky industry itself to actually refine this detailing as you describe it?
In some part very enthusiastic, in other part not so. It was very much a point of really you insist, in some point maybe even a little bit daring, step into perhaps a place that maybe other people will say, well, you shouldn't go there. Really, I would say just a lot of hard work to get to become known, to become recognized, mainly sometime in being a little bit too daring, I suppose. But I would say that on the whole, this is very friendly industry that as soon as people know that you are enthusiastic about it, that you want really to push the interests of the industry forward, and then people will come to you. People will be happy to help.
Yeah, well, certainly nobody could accuse you of not being enthusiastic. In fact, you have a very exalted position as a keeper of the quaich. Can I just ask, how do you become involved in that society of the keepers of the quaich?
You don't really become involved, that at least my understanding, until the society itself show interest, or members of the society, very much nominating you, I suppose. to the owner, this is due to what you do. And when it's become recognized, then I suppose the interest will become within the society. It's not goes the other way around. So once you've been nominated and been second by another, it's all internal. So existing keepers, it will come, my understanding, to a review by a certain committee that
Yes.
will review your case if you are merit the honor or not.
Yes. Well, you obviously merited the honour. There's no doubt about it. Do you find it's opened doors for you, being a keeper of the Quaich? To the whisky world in particular, I'm thinking.
Yes. Yeah. Again, it does to some side of it, and perhaps not so to others. It is an honor, but it's an honor that many people, and indeed within the industry itself, are not familiar with. And sometimes just, handing a business card saying that you are a keeper of the Quaich, or mentioning that you are so, can come with a face that, okay, so what that mean?
Yes.
So yes, there is a good level of understanding, but there is as well the side that doesn't know you from Adam.
Yeah, it's almost like being a blue badge guide sometimes, isn't it?
In many ways, there is a lot of similarities there. Yes.
Yes.
But it's certainly a privilege and an honor, and whether you are recognized or not, I always feel very privileged to be one.
Yes. I know you give tastings of whisky all over the world, and most recently, because of the COVID lockdown, you've been doing virtual whisky tastings. Can I just ask, do you choose the whisky, or do the clients choose the whisky? And I see there's a bottle sitting behind you on that table. Maybe you can chat about that as well, please.
Yes, what I've got in here. Well, that's actually answer your question very well, because those 6 small bottles that you can see here have been sent to me 2 weeks ago by a regular participant in my overseas Zoom tasting or virtual tasting from California, San Francisco area. And after we've been doing so many sessions for close to a year, they decided to send me something so we can all have the same. So we can all literally, because as you can appreciate, unless you are a distiller and you're able to send, samples in a given time, people open the sample that have been delivered to them, then all you have to do is perhaps have certain ideas, and we can I lead the session by saying, how about if we'll do wood finishing today, or how about if we'll do blends today, or how about if we'll do a certain area or a certain character. Normally I'll try to do it starting with the more lighter one, non-peated, and then finish with the peated whiskies. More an idea that once you try a peated whiskey, it's very much staying on a palate.
Yes.
It's very hard to appreciate something which is a non-peated. So it's a very free flow. I would give a certain indication what I would like to try or to taste, but each one's sitting in their own home with the whiskies that they have there, and it's very much up to them to pick up whatever they wish. And I do likewise with the extensive collection. You can see part of it behind me. And the other bottle that you've got in here is my own private bottling. Alistair McDermott and myself bottled in 2008 a cask that we own from Glenglasser Distillery, which again, a great one, which I can offer a private visit to this distillery next to Portsoy in the north of Scotland.
I know Portsoy. Yeah, in fact, I stayed at Portsoy a number of years ago. It's got a beautiful harbour and a small beach.
And the boat festival take place there in a non-COVID time as well. Should have been, I think, this month, in fact.
Yes,
I can't remember exactly.
And that's quite exciting, certainly for people listening. If you're looking to come to Scotland, the Moray Coast is a wonderful place to visit as well, apart from being right next to Speyside, where most of the whiskies are distilled.
Yeah.
A rather simple question, I hope. If a novice whisky drinker was looking for advice on where to start, what type of whisky would you recommend, do you think?
I would say that first of all, I would try and ask the person a couple of questions, which is most likely what kind of whiskies they have tried. They maybe remember one or two, or if they would say this is going to be our first one, or, we are sampling whiskies occasionally here and there. So this will give me a good idea. If they would say, we tried a famous brand, perhaps the one that more widely available, the Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Macallan, and so on, then that will give me indication. If they will say, oh, we actually sample some of the peaty one from Islay, for example, Lafroig or Lagavulin, are big, more of the well-known, then again, that will give me some indication. But generally, I would always say, start with something that is easy on the palate. That will be my idea. Don't assault the palate with something which is very much a love or hate. You may like it very much, and I hope that will be the case, but you might be put off from trying Scotch whiskey by maybe trying something that is a little bit too strong for a novice drinker. So it's a safer way to start. And one of the things that I was involved in a while ago with the Scotch Whisky Experience in Edinburgh, just below the castle, is a program by which barmen or people that work in different Scotch whisky environment will perhaps learn to ask a few questions before they're going to give what they feel is the favorite one, but might be really the one that will put off a potential drinker because that's not the one for them. So ask and listen rather than force whatever you believe that will be the right one.
Yes. Sound advice, Ronni. Sound advice. Thank you so much. A slightly more technical question. How do you view the connection between distillery brand and its location?
I appreciate it very much. So being a Scottish Blue Badge tourist guide, like yourself, John, I always appreciate that Scotland is a country that have a lot to offer, and the road to the distillery, including the location of the distillery, put a lot of character into the brand itself. So it's very important for me that as people coming all the way from respective countries, or maybe even just down the road from England, or indeed from Scotland itself, from the cities into some of Scotland region and visit some of the distilleries, that they will have more sense of a place, of a little bit of the history, rather than just the brand itself, which they'll be able to, in fact, sample gladly anywhere else. So to me, those points are really coming together. The location is very, very much part of it, and the locations not always have to be a picturesque one. And one of the things that I always trying to convince my clients or my visitors on my private Scotch whisky tours is the fact that not necessarily a not very picturesque distillery acquaint to a not good or not a palatable sample of whiskey. Sometimes is have no correlation between a very beautiful place and the flavor that the distillery will provide for you. So it's all about the individual introduction for brands, for whiskey that perhaps are not well known, including the one which are well known, because I really don't think that the well-known brands doing anything bad. The fact that they are well known, and a very common question that I do get from visitors or requests is, don't take us to the big brand, take us to the family-owned, to the small. And to me, you should have interest in both, because the big one out there, because they're doing something very, very good. They are excellent, and hence they are where they are. And equally, the small one, it's nice to be with a place that it's a little bit more on a smaller scale of production rather than the big one. So the good thing about the Scotch whisky industry, that it's very much an industry that can offer you both, and you shouldn't shun one in favor of the other just because it's one that you regularly see on shelf in shops or indeed in airport and so on, and therefore think that it's not merit the visit. I think they are merit the visit, whether they're big or small, whether they're picturesque or not. So I try to introduce to my client a broader picture of the industry that will cover all aspects of what we can offer in Scotland. And thankfully, we have a lot to offer.
Yeah, certainly from touring around Scotland with guests, clients of mine who wanted to see some whisky distilleries, even I'm rather taken aback by the large number of distilleries that are springing up all of a sudden. And I know of at least 10 new distilleries just last year. But interestingly enough, they're quite small distilleries. For example, the Clydeside distillery and the one down in Leith. So these new distilleries, the smaller, you could almost say they're catering for maybe a younger generation. And part of my next question really is, Do you think the Scotch whiskies moved with the times to perhaps accommodate a new generation approach to drinking whiskey? We always were told just put a tiny drop of water in, but these people are starting to put lots of water, maybe even mixers. What's your feeling on that?
First of all, I must say that the Scotch whisky industry moved very, very well into the 21st century. And I think the innovative side of it, the coming up with a new idea that, of course, the regulation of Scotch whisky permits are fast. A lot of wood finishing, a lot of new idea of how to drink the whisky, in which environment, which way. And certainly I do advocate, add some water, try it first of all as it is, and then maybe add a drop or two of water. But I think the most important thing is really to accept that people will drink whiskey whichever way comfortable for them. Like, we can give them the advice, but they will find whichever way. If they want to add water, then fantastic. If they feel that they somewhat changing it too much and they rather have it pure as the distillers thought to bring to them, then that's fine as well. There's really no good or bad, right or wrong in Scotch whisky. I think it's very much something that each one find how it worked for them. And if we advocate this approach to it, then I think we'll more and more people will join, and certainly the younger generation. Now, to the second part of it, the small distilleries. There is, of course, the idea is kind of coming to an end in my mind, but the mushrooming of new distilleries that's starting always. To start a whiskey distillery, it's a big risk. There's a lot of investment. We need to know, and of course, I'm sure you will explain, and that first and foremost, Scotch cannot be called Scotch until it matures 3 years and 1 day here in Scotland.
Yes.
So what do you do in the meantime? There are expenses in production, in all other matter of setting up a distillery, and you may have to wait quite a long time before you can see anything coming back in. So to do it on a smaller scale, it's always going to be safer in many ways, allowing you as well perhaps to offer prospective customers a faster spirits like gin, for example, that you can do today and perhaps put in bottle next week rather than waiting 3 years. So the smaller distilleries are, I would call them a boutique distillery because they are very much more into the very diversified. It's very easy to change things in them and do move about in order to make sure that you will be able to move with the time in trends and so on that drinkers will look into. A lot of the big distilleries are distilleries that are there from the 18th century, 19th century, some from the 18th century, the 19th century. So they grew with time. They understood what people want, and according to that, their capacity has been increased, their ability to reach a far-fetched market all over, and therefore they become global icon, and we can see their bottles all over the world. They, in many ways, are the one that opened the road to the small distilleries of today, that on the back of the success of the big one and the success of Scotch whisky are able to open their small distilleries now and offer another angle, perhaps more diversifying, to new drinkers. So I think, again, as I mentioned before, those two work together.
Yeah,
and
of course.
I one thing that I would like to add is the term craft. A lot of visitors believe that they should be taken to a craft distillery. Every distillery, big or small, is craft to me, because whatever they do is unique to them, and hence that's the term craft. If you want to refer to the size, then maybe use small or large or boutique distillery rather than use the term craft, because whether you are a huge distillery, you still are very much craft, because whatever you create is unique to you, big or small.
Thank you. If one of your clients took a lovely single malt and put Coca-Cola in it, what would you say?
I would say drink it in whichever way you feel is right for you. However, I will provide explanation that perhaps this great product that was thought after, have been crafted for so many years, should be considered to be sampled, at least at the beginning, exactly as the producer wanted you to sample it before you immediately change it. But if putting Coca-Cola into your Scotch whisky is what make it more drinkable for you, then go ahead, do it.
Good.
Just give it the chance to try it as it meant to reach you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I'm with you there, actually. I'm with you, and I'm not a keeper of the Quaich, but I'm right with you. A slightly more technical question. I think it was Samuel Bronfman who said distilling's a science, blending's an art. Your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, that's the point of malt versus blend, if we can call it versus, because I don't think it's really one against the other. One of perhaps the more common quest or thoughts that I do get from my customers as they're coming to my private tours is almost somewhat looking down at blends, thinking them of being inferior to malt. And it's always very important for me to explain to people that those two are two different animals. Yes, they are categorized as Scotch whisky because both of them coming under the umbrella of Scotch whisky, but they're very much different, and there's no way of comparing them both. Single malt, as we know, it's a product of one single distillery, and the distillation is the science, how you produce it. But the blend is the art by which you bring those individual styles of so many distilleries and you craft it together to create something which is more harmonized, balanced, and palatable. I'm coming from a generation of blends drinkers. I mean, I was exposed to single malt far later than I did for the blends, and I have a lot of appreciation for blended whiskey, and this is the backbone of our industry. Yeah. I would urge people to perhaps have another thought about it. And certainly, like anything else, if you want to go to the bottom shelf, then maybe you're going to have a product that perhaps not so desirable to you, and that's maybe going to put you off the category of blend. But certainly if you're going to go and maybe slightly something a little bit more expensive, but have an age statement on it, like for example 12 years old, then you have to remember that the blenders work very, very hard in order to put everything in this product at 12 years or older. So how can that possibly be bad? I don't know. So it's just a case of really people being not so much judging and putting just different statement, or that's not as good as that, but rather giving it more time and try, because I can offer people absolutely outstanding blended whiskies, throughout the market that you will be really, really not only fortunate, but you will enjoy drinking.
Great. Thank you, Ronni. One final question, and I'm going to be a bit naughty here because I'm actually going to ask you, what's your favourite whiskey, please?
I've been asked this quite a lot again throughout the tours, and indeed when I'm hosting different whiskey event tasting or whiskey dinners, which I do frequently, people always ask which one is your favorite. It's a hard one, because I suppose the easiest way to say is I really don't have a favorite one. I've been very fortunate to sample endless amount of whiskies, hundreds new ones every year, through visiting privately many distilleries with my client, offer unique experience in each distillery that allow you to sample perhaps things which are not part of the general range that you can see on the shelf and so on. It's a voyage of discovery. You maybe think that this one was really outstanding, and the next one perhaps will be even more palatable to you. So I think the futile search for the best or the number one is really exactly that, futile. There's no point of doing it. It's much more about carry on trying, sampling, and find the one that's right for you. Finding your right whiskey is a lot to do with the mood that you're in on particular time when you try it. Could be on the weather outside, the climate. Could be whether you're celebrating or perhaps where you want to drown your sorrows. So it's a living drink that very much fit to how you want to enjoy it, and therefore I find that I enjoy new ones. Which are very much, I'm sampling new things as we speak that have been launched literally in the last couple of weeks or a couple of months, and I'm very much enjoying going back to something that I drank 10, 15 years ago, and I know that it can give me what I want in a certain point in time when I feel that's the right one. Sometimes I prefer the contribution of the American white oak that give the sort of nice vanillin oak tannin that giving you much more of perhaps of the tropical side to it, and sometimes I enjoy much more the contribution of the sherry wine and the sherry bat from Jerez in Spain that given us much more of the dryness and the fruitiness into it. Sometimes I want something very, very sweet, and you can go into Pedro Jimenez or Sauternes wine or Burgundy or various things like that, Marsala. Other time, the American white oak, just by the sweet vanilla and coconut that they're giving you, will be exactly what you're looking for. So perhaps if I would have to go, if you permit me one finishing note, if I would have to end my days and the Almighty will say, pick up your favorite bottle to take with you, perhaps my answer will be, give me 3 years to think about it. And then perhaps I will take about 20 different bottles because they're all, my favorite.
We must try and get you on Desert Island Discs. Just that you'd be pinned. You would have to be pinned down on the favorite bottle you wanted. But anyway, it's
I can give you currently perhaps something that very much intrigued me at the moment, and if you want, and that
yes, do.
What's
What's intriguing you at the moment?
At the moment, I'm very much fascinated by new innovation that happen in the whiskey industry, the extensive use in different type of wood finishing, mainly of dessert wine, different type of sherries, not necessarily always the Oloroso, but perhaps Pedro Jimenez, Manzanilla, Palo Cortado, and so on. And indeed, things like port and Burgundy and Marsala and Sauternes and various things like that. So I'm very much into the port finishing at the moment, and particularly one that I enjoy very much coming from Campbelltown, from Glen Scotia Distillery in Campbelltown.
Yeah.
I've always been a great fan of the work that's done in Glen Scotia, and for, sadly, the non-happening Campbelltown Whisky Festival that was due to happen in May this year, they produced a bottling cask strengths of a peated whiskey from this distillery at 14 years old that finished in tawny port, and it's sublime, the smokiness, a very slight smokiness, very, very light one, and the sort of fruity note that coming from the tawny port at cask strengths at 14 years, I think they really produce something which is pleasure to drink.
Well, can I just say, you've got my mouth watering now, actually, Ronni. I'm hoping to head up to Campbelltown in the next month or so, because I'm doing recce's up there. I'm certainly going down to Islay, and as far as I'm concerned, heading to Islay, you've got to pass through Campbelltown. So I might just follow your lead, so thank you for that little tip. Well, Ronni, it's been an absolute privilege to have you on this podcast, and I'm sure my listeners will have been delighted to hear from a real whiskey expert and one with such a love of Scotland's national drink. So thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Enjoy Islay and Campbelltown. I hope to get there myself soon enough.
Thank you. I certainly will, Ronni. Thank you very much indeed. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, that was Ronni Berry, whisky expert and keeper of the Quaich. And you can find Ronni on his website at www.scottishwhiskytours.co.uk. And you can follow him on Instagram at Ronni Berry, and also on his Facebook business page, Whisky Tours with Ronni. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this first episode of my whisky series and hearing about the history of our famous drink, Uiscevach, how it came to Scotland, the illicit stills around Loch Drunkey, and the amazing number of distilleries in Scotland today. It has also been a pleasure and honour hearing from Ronni Berry, a keeper of the Quaich. In next week's episode 2 of my whisky series, we will visit a distillery and you'll find out exactly how we turn water into liquid gold, the elixir of life, the golden nectar. We will also have a guest with us from the production side of a distillery, so that will be fascinating. Well, if you wish to listen to my other podcasts that I have, then why don't you subscribe on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. Or if you have any comments or questions about this or any of my podcasts, drop me a line at john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, or drop me a line via the contact form on my website. Well, it's been a real pleasure having you with me on this first part of our whisky journey. Please do join me next week to hear more of the alchemy of whisky and to hear from a man that's worked in the industry for many years. If you're relaxing with a wee dram yourself at this very moment, then to you, wherever you are, I raise my glass and I wish you Slàinte mhath.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive scottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.